Friends, if you enjoy my content, please support the channel. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Many watch but don't subscribe. For you, it's one click, but it really helps the channel grow. Your feedback matters. I read all your comments. Thank you for your support. The concrete swallowed sound. That was the first, most pervasive truth of the subterranean complex. The unstated rule that governed the life of the unnamed technician whose job was to keep the circuits humming beneath the scorched, silent expanse of the Nevada scrubland. His domain was Level 3, a realm of heavy-gauge wiring, pressurized conduits, and communication hubs that connected this facility to the outside world, a world that felt more mythical with every passing shift. He worked as an electrician, though the labor here focused less on diagnosing faulty breakers and more on monitoring the slow, steady decay of systems designed to last 1,000 years. The walls were phenomenal. 10 feet of dense, reinforced concrete, layered with lead and depleted uranium mesh. This construction was overkill for any conventional bunker. It spoke not of keeping things out, but of keeping things in. The air presented the worst condition. It was heavy, filtered through vast industrial lungs, tasting faintly of ozone, hot insulation, and the stale, manufactured chill of overworked air conditioning. It carried a metallic bite that made his sinuses ache by midnight, a taste that never fully departed the back of his throat. And the light. God, the light. Sharp, unyielding, white fluorescent tubes stretched in infinite parallel lines down the corridors. It was a brutal, clinical illumination, calibrated never to flicker, never to dim, never to hint at the comforting cycle of day and night. It was eternal midnight, stripped of shadows and stars, replaced by a cold, surgical glare that leached color from everything, including the human spirit. He was tracing a newly installed fiber trunk line running toward the service junction known as the Delta Node, a place he routinely avoided due to its unsettling proximity to the lower levels. As he pulled his heavy tool bag, a leather satchel worn smooth over 15 years of service, along the corridor, the silence deepened. This was not the expected hum of a deep underground facility. Where he worked, the massive air compressors cycled. The distant hydraulic pumps groaned as they moved colossal blast doors, and the personnel upstairs murmured. But here, approaching the Delta Node, there was nothing. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was a profound, suffocating void, a deafening vacuum that actively consumed ambient noise. He felt it physically, a subtle but distinct pressure drop against his eardrums, the kind of stillness that suggested the space itself was disconnected from the normal physics of the world. It was the sound of something waiting to breathe. He knew the official blueprint showed 3 subterranean levels, all tied into the central power plant he maintained. But years of late-night repairs and dumpster dives for salvageable parts had secured an unauthorized library of forgotten schematics. Hidden in a rusted government-issue cabinet near the main junction box were brittle vellum papers detailing subsections he was never meant to see. These faded drawings showed notations for structures stretching far deeper than Level 3. The maps referred to Level 4, Level 5, all the way down to a chillingly designated Level 11. These were not extensions of the existing grid. They were isolated sections, marked by cryptic acronyms that sounded less like aerospace engineering or particle physics and more like medieval alchemical symbols. He reached the Delta Node, a massive, reinforced intersection where the power conduits plunged sharply downward. The corridor changed subtly here. The standard aluminum access doors, common elsewhere, were replaced by behemoths of steel. These multi-ton slabs were sealed by redundant thermal bolts. He ran his gloved hand over the cold surface. It was not standard radiation shielding, though the lead content was high. The alloy was exotic, formulated to resist high-velocity impacts. The composite used to protect against shaped charges and kinetic penetrators. These doors held no external mechanisms for dealing with nuclear fallout or exotic pathogens. They were built for one specific purpose: to resist immense, brute, non-human physical force. They were containment. As he stripped the insulation from the new cable run, he noticed the shift in the ventilation. Usually, the recycled air here felt heavy with the sterile scent of powerful high-efficiency particulate air filtration. Near the containment doors, however, the air was a terrible cocktail. It was clinical, aggressive blasts of chlorine and sharp iodine, but interwoven with it was a heavy, wet, pervasive odor. It was animal musk. This was not the faint, earthy smell of a field mouse or a desert fox. This was primal, deep, and concentrated, like the floor of a large, poorly cleaned zoo enclosure, mixed with the harsh, aggressive tang of industrial bleach fighting a losing battle. It clung to the pores of the concrete and immediately permeated the weave of his standard-issue blue coveralls. The smell was heavy, visceral, and totally inexplicable in a cutting-edge military research facility. It did not smell like a lab. It smelled like a cage. He tied off the last of the connections, the musk thick in his nostrils, and began the long, silent walk back toward the meager comfort of Level 3. He stood as the maintenance man, the fragile barrier between the functional world and the deep, silent terror that lay 11 stories below. The fluorescent light, eternal and unchanging, felt less like illumination now, and more like a fragile shield. He disliked how little sound traveled this far. He disliked the implications of the silence. His routine was clockwork, a necessity in a world governed by redundant protocols and precise power outputs. But the deeper he sank into the facility's quiet machinery, the more he noticed the subtle fractures in the system. Fractures that were not electrical, but biological and social. The first hint was the shift schedule. Every employee at the facility adhered to a rigid, rotating schedule designed to prevent burnout and ensure cross-training, except for those assigned to the lower regions, Level 7, Level 8, and Level 9. He never saw them. Their sign-in sheets remained sequestered. Their designated meal breaks occurred when the cafeteria was sterilized and locked down for cleaning, and their transport elevators were keyed to bypass all intermediate levels. Their uniforms, too, were strange. While the rest of the staff wore simple, standardized charcoal gray or olive drab, these lower-level technicians wore dark blue, nearly black jumpsuits with bizarre, segmented patches near the shoulder that looked less like rank insignia and more like an abstract depiction of skeletal structure. When, on extremely rare occasions, he caught a glimpse of one of these individuals rounding a corner near the restricted service ducts, their faces were the most striking feature. They were not arrogant or secretive like field agents. They were heavy-lidded, perpetually tense, etched with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. It was a raw, worn-down desperation, the look of people who lived in perpetual dread, waiting for an alarm that would signal the end of everything. They carried a weight that the upper levels, dealing with communication satellites and theoretical propulsion systems, simply did not share. One sweltering afternoon, they were scheduled for a mandatory 4-hour blackout on Level 3 to upgrade the main power transformer. The entire level plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the sickly amber glow of emergency markers. Taking advantage of the rare opportunity to inspect some inaccessible conduit runs, the technician ventured down a tight, little-used service corridor near the elevator shaft for Level 7. The air felt humid here, and in the beam of his heavy-duty flashlight, the corridor concrete looked strangely mottled. Then he saw the marks. The marks appeared similar to scuffs from heavy military-issue boots, but the pattern was fundamentally wrong. The length of the stride impressed into the dusting of concrete flour was monstrous. 5 feet or more between impact points, utterly impossible for a man walking normally. And embedded deep into the rough concrete surface, where a heel or a toe belonged, were distinct, horrifying gashes. They were deep gouges, almost perfectly parallel, spaced like the tips of immense, heavy claws. The floor surrounding the tracks was also wet, with a slick, vaguely oily residue that caught the flashlight beam and refused to dry, even in the desert air. It clung, sticky, to the soles of his work boots. He moved past them quickly, a cold prickle chasing itself up his spine. Later that week, in the oppressive silence of the central staff mess hall, the air conditioners thrumming loudly enough to suppress easy conversation, he heard it. 2 facility security officers, big men, armored and heavily armed, were talking in low, clipped tones over their bland, heavily salted dinners. They were discussing a problem in what they referred to only as Alpha 2 Block, a sector he knew was adjacent to the restricted lower levels. One of them leaned in, his voice barely audible above the synthetic drone of the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. The pressure readings remain unstable. If we get another incident like last week, the containment field won't hold Alpha 2. We cannot afford another breach from the dogmen. The word hit him with the physical force of a heavy-gauge cable whipping against bone. Dogmen. It was so outrageously out of place, so bizarrely mythological in the context of advanced physics and military containment, that it instantly lodged itself in his memory, vibrating with an unnatural significance. The first clear observation occurred 3 days later. The complex fire suppression system was notorious for false alarms, triggered mostly by dust buildup or thermal fluctuations. That evening, a major coolant pipe burst on Level 8, tripping the emergency cutoff and causing a localized temporary breach in containment isolation protocols. One of the hardened safety windows, reinforced with 7 inches of polymer and wire mesh, slid open automatically to vent heat and pressure. The technician was monitoring the diagnostics feed on Level 3 when the video stuttered and stabilized, showing a momentary grainy snapshot of the Level 8 service tunnel. It was only a glimpse, maybe 2 seconds before the automated safety system slammed the window shut, but it was enough to fuse the image behind his eyes forever. A silhouette stood 20 feet from the lens. It was tall, impossibly lean, a network of visible tendons and hardened muscle stretched beneath coarse, dark hide. It was bipedal, standing on legs bent unnaturally backwards at the knee, shoulders slumped forward. but the head was what terrified him. It was too large for the torso, heavy-skulled and long-snouted. The eyes were the worst. They reflected the weak, sickly yellow emergency lighting, lacking any visible sclera. They were two large, viscous, perfectly black discs, like polished obsidian. What truly horrified him was not the creature's sheer, monstrous physicality, but its stillness. It did not pace. It neither scratched nor rattled the bars. It stood motionless, perfectly calm, its large head cocked slightly to the left, peering directly through the newly opened observation window, directly into the camera lens. It was looking, observing, studying. There was no panicked, blind animal instinct in that posture. It was analysis. The unsettling certainty settled over him like a burial shroud. This was not a beast of the wild. This was something with a chilling, focused mind, calculating the efficacy of the glass between them. The immediate aftermath of the coolant burst on level 8 was swift damage control, executed with a practiced, terrified efficiency that spoke volumes about previous incidents. The ventilation system, running on backup power, worked over time to purge the contaminated air. But the chemical scent, the aggressive mix of chlorine and iodine, failed to suppress what came next. The air began to carry a heavy, cloying, metallic aroma. It was the smell of blood. Not old, dried iron oxide, but thick, fresh, oxidized blood mixed with the high, searing scent of hot, sheared metal. It was the stench of raw tissue violently separated, a smell that permeated every seal and shaft, suggesting a wound of catastrophic scale that was being aggressively, but not entirely successfully, sealed off. He worked his shift with a constant, low-grade nausea, the reality of the dogmen pressing closer. His technician's pass, which granted him wide access to communication hubs and data conduits, became his key to a far more dangerous form of investigation. Using a seldom-used service terminal deep within the wiring plenum of Level 3, he managed to worm his way into an old, poorly secured auxiliary server labeled Archive Beta. The server was ancient, running a proprietary operating system from the late 1980s, but it held gold. After hours of scrolling through dense, redacted technical jargon and poorly scanned documents, the classification was confirmed. The term dogman was not slang. It was the official, highly sensitive biological classification, Canis adaptus. The documents described them not as mythological monsters, but as biological samples requiring level Alpha 2 containment. He devoured the internal memos. The logic of containment was terrifyingly clear. They were described as hyper-predators, capable of complex social interaction, tactical formation, and abstract strategic planning. The memos discussed the necessity of 10-foot-thick, polymer-reinforced concrete structures. This was not to stop an earthquake. This was to contain an organism that could systematically dismantle its environment. But the real terror lay in the operational protocols. One line, repeated with chilling emphasis in every manual, burned itself into his mind. Avoid direct visual contact. Subjects replicate observed behavioral patterns and mimic physical morphology for infiltration purposes. The creatures did not just imitate appearance. They studied movement, gait, and mannerisms. They learned how to be human by watching. Further digging into the older, more theoretical files brought a fascinating, horrible twist. They were not beasts, but technologies, or rather the organic product of advanced biological engineering. A technical document dated from a forgotten Black project used the phrase, adaptational form. He realized then that the old legends, the flickering myths of lycanthropy that scared children in the suburbs, were simply human civilization trying to categorize an evolutionary tool. The creatures did not transform magically in moonlight. They possessed the biological machinery to change their density, tissue structure, and epidermal layering as an instrument of efficient infiltration and survival. The werewolf was the most successful camouflage system ever devised. The facility's true purpose snapped into focus. The 7-watt sodium lamps that dimly lit the farthest reaches of the sub-basement, the sharp, relentless white light of the fluorescent tubes. They were no longer mere lighting. They felt like tangible boundaries, lines of defense against a form that preferred darkness and shadow for its shifts. He looked at his calloused hands, hands that knew the difference between a hot wire and a neutral ground, and realized the profound shift in his reality. He was not a technical employee at a top-secret research base, responsible for maintaining military hardware. He was a jailer and attendant, a specialized janitor for the most dangerous form of life humanity had ever encountered. He was the lowliest cog in a planetary cage, responsible for making sure the power stayed on so the things in the deep darkness did not breach the lock on the door. That night, going through the daily maintenance log, he saw a note from a Level 7 technician, one of the haunted men in the black jumpsuits. The note was terse. Thermal spikes Level 7. Observation confirms mimicry of service access codes, adjusting frequency to Alpha 5. Mimicry of access codes. They were not breaking the system physically. They were learning the language of the system itself. The enemy was not brute strength. It was malignant, adaptive intelligence, capable of operating the very machine that contained it. The knowledge made the stale, ozone-scented air impossible to breathe. Every shadow held a possibility, and every silent corner concealed a lesson being learned in the dark. The deeper the technician delved into the fragmented and often self-contradictory records of Archive Beta, the clearer the terrifying hierarchy became. The werewolf was merely a bridge. The dogman was the destination. The distinction was not between the wild and the domesticated, but between the transitional and the controlled. The former was the form for movement and short-term hunting. The latter, the fully realized, intelligent, organized species. He located a particularly disturbing set of files, heavily classified and marked obsolete, non-replicable, dating back to the late 1960s. It described the first fully documented case of morphological infiltration. A subject captured in the arid scrub near the facility perimeter, a typical bipedal canine form, was placed under observation in a sealed medical bay. Within 4 hours after prolonged, intense exposure to the facility's medical team, the subject began to change. It did not convulse or scream. It simply flowed. The creature took on the physical parameters of one of the chief attending physicians, duplicating not just his face and build, but the texture of his uniform, including the specific creases in the lab coat material near the shoulder. The adaptation was near instantaneous, terrifyingly precise, and horrifically effective. The technician sat back, the fluorescent light harsh on his exhausted eyes. This was not mythology being weaponized. This was advanced biological mimicry being perfected. The realization rewrote 60 years of Cold War history in his head. He saw clearly now that the vast, opaque government efforts in this sector had never focused on destroying or expelling the creatures. The focus was always on utilization and containment. The cold, hard pragmatism of the mid-20th century military mind determined that if these things could survive and adapt anywhere, they were the ultimate infiltration tool, a perfect biological weapon. They failed, of course, because the creatures proved too intelligent, too complexly organized, and too focused on their own goals to be controlled by human beings. The gnawing tension that pervaded the facility was not just about security clearance. It was a profound, suffocating psychological strain. The dogmen knew they were being studied, contained, and potentially exploited. Their containment, the technician realized, was not a desperate attempt at flight. It was a passive, defiant resistance. They were not running away from the facility. They were waiting for the right moment to stroll out the front door, wearing someone else's face. His paranoia sharpened, honed by the archive files, into a desperate need to know what was happening now. Using his communications access, he rerouted a rarely used maintenance feed to level 8 and began scrubbing the archived camera footage from the night of the system failure. Hours melted away as he watched loops of silent, grainy, infrared video. Most of it was predictable. Empty corridors, dust motes floating in the thin shafts of light. Emergency teams moving quickly after the coolant rupture. Then there was a break in the pattern. A lone security guard, a burly man he vaguely recognized from the mess hall, was walking his assigned patrol near the echo block, a stretch of corridor that appeared completely normal. The guard reached a junction, glanced sharply around the corner, and abruptly stopped. He did not draw his weapon. He did not activate his communication device. He simply paused, perfectly still, for 10 endless seconds. Then, very slowly, deliberately, the guard turned his back on the junction, holstered his sidearm, and walked away into the shadows of the unlit corridor. He moved with the quiet acquiescence of a man following an instruction. The camera, fixed to its preset arc, slowly panned back to the empty junction, searching the darkness where the guard had been looking. The technician watched the feed for 15 minutes. Nothing. Only the slow play of shadow, the subtle movements of dust motes, and the wet sheen on the floor that he knew was residue. The horror was the empty frame. The creature did not need to attack. It achieved its goal by conveying a request. It exercised a subtle, coercive power that broke the man's will without breaking his body. The guard chose compliance over confrontation. The silence, the meticulous attention to detail, and the profound strategic calm he had observed in the facility were the characteristics of a vastly superior intellect preparing for a transition. He realized he was surrounded not by human beings, but by potential human shapes, all waiting for the opportune moment to shed their skin. The rupture came 3 nights later, not with a bang, but with a calculated, engineered electronic whimper. It was 2 o'clock in the morning and the technician was checking the tertiary power regulators on level 3. Suddenly, the deep, underlying hum of the facility, the steady 60 hertz drone that had been the background noise of his life for years, fell silent. It was a cessation. The main circuits went dead, followed by the backup generators. Then, the communications grid sputtered into darkness. The centralized access control systems, The elaborate interlocking electronic bolts on the lower-level doors went cold. The harsh fluorescent lighting blinked out, replaced instantly by the terrible arterial red glare of the emergency lights, casting the familiar corridors in a bloody, panic-inducing tint. The entire complex was plunged into a state of coordinated total technological paralysis. The cause was a precise surgical shutdown, initiated from one of the deepest, most secure levels, overriding all safety protocols. It was a planned, decisive move. He was trapped in his technical node, the thick, heavy door sealed by its own magnetic locks. He scrambled to get the local diesel generator online, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the vents, suddenly working on residual battery power, came a stench so powerful, so aggressive, that it cut through the metallic reek of the electrical burnout. It was an unbearable combination: burning copper and plastic, mixed with the overwhelming, heavy odor of wet dog and a powerful metallic musk. Underlying all of it was a searing chemical smell: raw ozone, the scent of electrical discharge and rapid metabolic change. It was the smell of friction, of rapid movement, of massive bodies shifting through tight conduits. He knew then, this was not an accident. This was the coordinated release. The dogmen had taken down the facility's central nervous system. He managed to restore power to a single, isolated camera feed linked to a thermal imaging lens near the level 8 junction. The view was chaotic. Shadows danced in the flickering red lights. But through the thermal lens, the pattern of movement was horrifyingly clear. The creatures were not running. They moved in precise, terrifyingly silent groups of 2 or 3, sticking close to the walls, utilizing the shadows of the maintenance stacks as natural cover. Their movements were fluid, precise, and utterly devoid of panic. What was most chilling about the thermal images was their temperature signature. While his own body and the surviving machinery glowed a dull, stressed yellow-orange, the creatures were a strangely mottled, low-level blue and green. They regulated their core temperature, running unnaturally cold despite the exertion, making them poor targets for the standard infrared sensors still operating on battery backup. They were specters in the machine. Then, the infiltration began. On the screen, the technician saw one of the immense multi-ton containment doors near the junction hiss open. The door had been electronically paralyzed but required massive manual force to shift. It slid back, revealing the corridor beyond. A figure emerged. It wore the full uniform of a level 5 maintenance worker, charcoal gray, standard issue. The resemblance was flawless. But as the figure moved into the light, the technician felt a dizzying wave of cold recognition. The posture was too perfect, the back unnaturally straight, the elbows held just slightly too far out from the body. The movement was a liquid glide, lacking the subtle, jerky imperfections of a tired human being. The thing in the uniform paused, looked calmly down the corridor, and then, using a set of borrowed security credentials, slipped into a service duct leading directly into the upper communications plenum. It had successfully infiltrated the system, and it was heading for the sensitive data archives on level 1. The technician stared at the image, numb. The creatures were not blindly seeking the nearest exit hatch, striving to escape the Nevada desert. Their objective was calculated and targeted. They were opening doors not out of the facility, but deeper into the facility's centralized intelligence. They were accessing server rooms, data banks, and strategic deployment maps. This was a hostile takeover. This was reconnaissance of their new territory, executed with chilling precision while the human staff scrambled blindly in the red light of the emergency power. They had not defeated the system through brute force. They had merely shut off the lights so they could read the blueprints. The system-wide paralysis lasted less than 3 hours, a testament to the facility's inherent redundant design. But those hours were a gift of chaos, a key the technician immediately exploited. With the central server nodes disconnected from the internal network for emergency scrubbing, the ancient demilitarized auxiliary files, Archive Beta, were briefly and entirely unsecured. He dove deep, bypassing standard security logs and jumping back decades, searching for the true genesis of the operation. He did not stop until he hit the mother lode, a series of heavily encrypted files dated 1947, labeled Operation Solstice Treaty. The contents did not speak of a crash or a recovery effort. They spoke of a landing. The documents detailed the arrival of a desperate delegation from an extrasolar species, one whose homeworld collapsed due to biological exhaustion. They were not invaders, but desperate refugees with a chillingly pragmatic proposal. They offered humanity sophisticated technologies, the fundamental principles that jump-started modern nuclear physics, advanced electronics, and the entire framework for jet propulsion, in exchange for a limited, controlled territory for biological adaptation. The mid-century governing bodies, mesmerized by the prospect of global technological dominance, agreed. Earth would become the ultimate incubator, a controlled environment for the seeding and development of a stable, hybridized species capable of surviving the planet's existing ecosystems. The facility in the desert, the heavily guarded, myth-shrouded Area 51, was established to manage the process of biological hybridization and to contain the first unstable generations of the adapted forms. The records detailed the selection criteria for the new species form. The wolf canine template was chosen not for mythological reasons, but for sheer biological efficiency. It seamlessly blended the strength and speed of a terrestrial apex predator with the bipedal dexterity and visual acuity of a primate, ensuring both effective hunting and successful masking. The true horror clicked into place. All the tales, the centuries of terror woven into European and American folklore, the creatures that walk on 2 legs and change form in the shadows, that was not just ancient superstition. That was human collective memory trying to process the first terrifyingly failed attempts at adaptation. The earliest forms, the ones that could not regulate their transformations, the ones that killed wildly and without strategy, those were the leaks, the failed experiments that birthed the legend of the werewolf. The technician sat on the cold floor of the wiring plenum, surrounded by a tangle of dead cable, the awful, stale air pressing in on him. He felt an icy realization grip his mind, a cold so profound it transcended fear. They were not interlopers. They were co-owners of the planet here by contract, sealed between desperate governments and a highly advanced, dying species. And now, 60 years later, the contract was fulfilled. The dogmen were no longer primitive subjects in a cage. They were citizens claiming their allotted land. The facility was a breeding ground and a staging area, nothing more. He was not a vital technician preserving the integrity of a defense shield. He was a jailer maintaining the infrastructure of an ongoing biological experiment, ensuring the comfort and security of a species that was methodically preparing to supplant his own. The sheer scale of the lie, the decades of government secrecy built on the foundation of an agreed-upon biological takeover, was overwhelming. The current panic and security measures were not about preventing infiltration. They were about minimizing disruption, managing the transition, and controlling the optics of the replacement. He stared at a schematic detailing the radiation shielding around level 11, meant not for external contaminants, but for containing the creature's rapid, unstable morphological transitions, which generated immense, erratic electromagnetic fields. He felt a deep, chilling sense of vertigo. The world outside, the sun-baked desert he longed to see again, was already compromised. The creatures in the deep were not waiting for release. They were waiting for their adapted, highly effective brethren on the surface to send the signal that the human infrastructure was ready to receive them. The desert facility was not a containment unit. It was the last heavily bolted doorway to a new reality. And someone, somewhere, had quietly unlocked it. When the central power system was fully restored 12 hours after the coordinated shutdown, the atmosphere in the complex was irrevocably changed. The clinical hum returned, but it was overshadowed by a frantic, brittle energy. Security personnel were no longer policing protocols. They were hunting. Their eyes scanned the shadows, checking ceiling tiles and ventilation grates, their weapons held at a low ready. They looked for things that moved, not things that failed. The technician, operating in the restored, brutal fluorescent light, felt his status shift instantly. He was no longer invisible, a silent background fixture. His movements were watched, his tool satchel checked, his access scrutinized. The knowledge he held, the contract, the mimicry, the infiltration, became a physical burden, weighing down his steps. Then came the smell, utterly alien to the sterile underground environment. The ventilation systems, now fully operational, began pushing air that smelled of fresh earth, ozone, and clean, wet rock. It was the unmistakable, powerful scent of a desert thunderstorm of rain falling heavily on dry clay. He stopped, wrench in hand, inhaling deeply. It was impossible. The air filtration system was closed-loop, designed to exclude the Nevada climate. The scent penetrated level 2 and level 3 because massive external airlocks, the main cargo and personnel gates, had been opened wide and recently, drawing in tons of humid, rain-soaked external air. The dogman had gone out. His inner monologue shattered into 1,000 shards of paranoia. Trust no one. The phrase pulsed in his skull with the rhythm of his racing heart. Who in this facility is human? Who has been replicated? He watched his colleagues. The way the cafeteria manager wiped down the counter, the precise, repetitive motion of a supervisor adjusting his spectacles, the overly enthusiastic, standardized pleasantries exchanged in the corridors. They were all too smooth, too measured. He looked for the fracture in the human mask, the millimeter of space where a wolf's muscle might torque the wrong way under a suit jacket. The inevitable order came. He had to descend to level 7 for an emergency diagnostic check on a localized power regulator that had failed during the chaos. He took the small, maintenance-only elevator down, the cage dropping quickly through the reinforced structure. When the doors opened on level 7, the silence returned, thick and absolute. This level was even more stark than the ones above. Unpainted, raw concrete, slick with condensation from the repaired coolant lines. He found the access panel, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled his tools out. The corridor was empty, save for the sickly red glow of an overhead warning light. Then he saw it, a single clear imprint on the newly wet concrete floor near the regulator housing. It was a massive paw print, deep and perfectly defined. The residue still glistened. It was fresh. Simultaneously, a sharp coppery scent hit him, chemical and metallic, mixed with a high, bitter odor. It was distinct, overpowering, a smell he had only seen classified in the archive notes. The volatile organic compound released during an unstable, rapid transformation. Almond and metal. He knelt, his attention focused on the complex wiring of the regulator, trying to work by practiced muscle memory. He lifted the wrench, prepared to make the crucial connection to bypass the damaged component. In that very moment, the sound arrived. It was not a growl, not a roar, not the familiar scrape of concrete. It was a sharp, low click. A rapid, dry sound, like two immense ceramic plates snapping together right next to his head. He froze, every muscle fiber in his body locked in place. The technician knew, with the primal certainty of prey, that the thing was less than 2 feet away. He did not dare turn his neck. He felt the proximity, a shift in the air pressure, and a heavy, hot expiration of breath on the thin hair at the back of his neck. The smell of animal musk, concentrated and terrifying, flooded his senses, overwhelming the sterile air. He was utterly exposed on his knees, his hands holding a conductor. He waited for the tearing, the inevitable violent destruction that was the price of his curiosity. But nothing moved. Only the breath, hot and steady, and the oppressive, analytical silence. The eternity lasted 30 seconds. The dry, percussive click did not repeat. The hot breath on his neck ceased. Slowly, agonizingly, the technician finished his connection, the wrench slipping slightly in his sweat-damp palm. The regulator lights flickered green. He stood, forcing his joints to move, and finally, glacially, turned around. The corridor was empty. The paw print was still there, but the smell of almond and metal was already dissipating into the powerful ventilation draft. Whatever it was, or whoever it was, had evaporated back into the silence. The creature had not attacked. It had stood inches away, waited for him to complete his essential work, and then silently departed. This was not a lapse in predatory instinct. It was a deliberate, cold, and calculated allowance. He was permitted to live. The realization brought a fresh wave of dread far worse than the fear of physical violence. He was allowed to live because he was irrelevant. He rushed back up to level 3 and returned to the salvaged protocols, rereading them through the lens of recent events. He saw the truth clearly now. The government was not trying to contain the dogmen. They were trying to control the rate of their emergence. The facility was not a maximum security prison. It was a planetary distribution center. The dogman's ultimate goal, as he pieced together from the old clinical memos, was not an apocalyptic war. War destroys infrastructure, property, and resources that they would soon need. Their plan was biological substitution. They sought to gradually, subtly, and biologically displace humanity, taking over the planet's systems through mimicry and hybridization. It was a quiet, gentle end to civilization, replacing one species with a superior, more adaptable one. The chilling, undeniable fact was that the hybrids, those forms that looked perfectly human, that knew how to hold a coffee cup and fill out a tax form had long ago left the facility. They were already integrated. They were the silent majority. The desert base had simply contained the non-adapted original stock, using it as a biological foundry and a testing ground for transformation stability. The staff still remaining at the facility were either deeply committed to the idea of controlled coexistence, or were themselves already replications, acting as the final security layer on a system that was designed to fail. Seeking a painful antidote to the claustrophobic dread, the technician turned on the single restricted news feed allowed on the staff monitoring screens. The headquarters feed, filtered through miles of concrete, showed a brightly lit report on a local news channel. The image was excruciatingly normal. A sun-drenched suburban street, children riding bicycles, neighbors exchanging pleasantries over a white picket fence, a spaniel chasing a bright red ball across a manicured lawn. The reporter smiled, talking about a mild summer and rising property values. This image of ordinary, warm reality beamed into the freezing, ozone-scented heart of the concrete bunker. Was the most brutal horror he had yet encountered. That world, so close yet so completely unreachable, was the world the dogmen had already successfully infiltrated. The calm, normal people smiling on the screen potentially wore the skin of the enemy. The technician looked at his reflection in the dark, smooth monitor glass. He saw a tired, middle-aged man with wide, frantic eyes. He was the last bastion of human knowledge in a system that was intentionally, systemically shutting down his species. The allowance to live, the non-attack on level 7, was the confidence of a species that knew its victory was already absolute, and the witness entirely harmless. The order came down at the beginning of his next shift, delivered by a messenger with a face so blandly perfect he could not recall ever seeing him before. He was instructed to sanitize and seal his technical node, hand over his keys, and prepare for immediate rotation. Rotation. It was the euphemism used for employees whose exposure level was deemed critical, usually followed by years of debriefing and monitored reassimilation into civilian life. But now the word sounded less like a transfer and more like an eviction. It felt like being granted permission to step outside the blast radius. A blast that had already happened. He meticulously cleaned his small, cramped office, wiping down the surfaces, destroying the few remaining physical notes he had made, and deleting the deep-scanned files from the archived servers. His hands moved mechanically, driven by a terrible finality. The paperwork arrived at the final checkpoint, administered by a woman in civilian attire whose eyes were too large and too bright in the dim hallway light. It was the standard ironclad non-disclosure agreement, barring him from speaking about experimental propulsion, advanced communication systems, or deep earth tunneling. But there was a new subclause, written in dense, legalistic language that seized his attention. Acknowledgement of non-obstruction of natural biological processes and irreversible planetary adaptation. Signing that document was not just sealing his silence. It was signing his philosophical surrender. It was agreeing that the extermination of his species was a natural process. He signed it anyway, the cheap ballpoint pen clicking loudly in the oppressive quiet. Integrity held no value against planetary mandate. On the long, winding walk toward the exterior airlocks, he heard the disturbance. A sharp, desperate noise cutting through the humming quiet of Level 2. It was a scream pitched in perfect human terror, instantly truncated. It was quickly muffled, not with a struggle, but with a deliberate muscular silencing. The technician flattened himself behind a stack of unused ventilation containers, his breath catching in his throat. A figure ran past the corridor junction, moving with terrible speed. It wore a technician's coveralls, identical to his own, but the gait was wrong. An almost liquid motion, faster and smoother than any human could sustain. The figure was a perfect replica, down to the worn leather tool satchel slung across its shoulder. But as the figure turned the corner into the main hallway, the technician saw the shadow. Under the harsh emergency light, the creature's shadow stretched out long and dark on the concrete. For a split second, the shadow moved independently of the figure, trailing it by a microsecond. It was taller, leaner, with a distinctly non-human head profile. It was the Dogman form, perfectly revealed in its dark echo, chasing the perfect imitation of a human being. The technician waited for 10 minutes, listening to the silence return, the image of the lagging shadow burning into his retina. He reached the final series of airlocks leading to the surface access tunnel. The colossal hydraulically sealed steel doors, designed to withstand a low-yield nuclear blast, were not locked. They were not broken either. They were simply ajar, resting open by about 3 inches on their massive pneumatic runners. It was the casual negligence of someone who had just stepped out and forgot to latch the screen door behind them. The heavy brown rubber gasket of the outer lock bore deep parallel scorch marks and long gouged scratches, smeared with dried rust-colored residue. These were not the violent, desperate marks of an attempted escape, but the bored, confident traces of an unhurried, authorized exit. He pushed the door open, the heavy steel groaning in protest. He stepped onto the final ramp. The air hit him, the real, unprocessed atmosphere of the Nevada desert. It smelled of sagebrush, burnt pinyon, and dry, gritty sand. It was clean, sharp, and brutally real after the years of filtered ozone. For a second, there was pure physical relief. The freedom of the sky, the vast, overwhelming space of the night desert. But the sensation of escape lasted less than a single breath. It was immediately crushed by a profound physical weight of total defeat. He had escaped the cage, only to realize the cage had moved, and the entire world was now behind bars. The unnamed technician drove his dusty government-issue sedan down the state highway. The road a black ribbon unraveling across the vast moon-silvered floor of the Nevada desert. The facility's perimeter lights, miles behind him, were the last sign of the life he had known. A hard, cold, manufactured life, but one that at least contained the boundaries of the terrifying truth. Now he was in the unbounded world, and the difference was immediate and palpable. The shadows along the roadside, cast long and grotesque by the full moon. Tonight, a chilling metallic white disk hanging low over the mountains, were too dense. He caught peripheral movement, forms too large for coyotes, too fast for roadrunners. They moved like dark, compressed fluid, slipping behind the massive boulders and into the deep culverts, always just outside the direct sweep of his headlights. He accelerated, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white bone. He needed gas. 50 miles out, he pulled into a small, isolated filling station attached to a tiny, fluorescent-lit convenience store. The air reeked of stale coffee and gasoline fumes, a welcome, mundane stench. The clerk behind the counter was an older woman, perhaps 60, wearing a floral-patterned smock. Her face was kind, lined with the gentle weariness of decades spent working nights in the quiet desert. But her eyes were unsettling. They were too wide, too calm, utterly devoid of the slight human tension that comes from boredom or late-night fatigue. They were simply receptive, waiting. He bought a coffee and a pack of generic cigarettes, keeping his movements fluid and normal. When the woman leaned over the counter to reach a lower shelf for his change, the movement was precise, almost mechanical. For a second, the thin fabric of her smock strained unnaturally over her shoulder and upper arm. He saw the sharp, rigid line of muscle beneath the cotton, a line too robust, too defined for a woman her age. It was the rigid, curved profile of a wolf's shoulder blade, barely contained beneath her human skin. He managed a weak, polite thank you and retreated to his car, heart pounding. The coffee tasted thin and metallic. He drove another 20 miles before pulling over, desperate for connection. He pulled out his personal cell phone, one of the few devices that had not been filtered or monitored inside the facility, and began calling old colleagues, friends, and family in other states, far from the Nevada staging area. The lines connected instantly. The signal was strong, but the ringing on the other end never resolved into a human voice. It was not a busy signal. It was not voicemail. It was a perfect, deep, resonant silence on the other end of the line, a vacuum. He tried 5 numbers, then 10, his hands trembling violently. Absolute, terrifying quiet. All the people he knew, the entire infrastructure of his personal world, had simply stepped away from their phones, simultaneously and permanently. The facility in the desert was not a prison he had escaped. It was a transmission site, a beacon. The powerful emitters he had maintained on level 3, theoretically for deep space communication, were broadcasting a continuous signal to the dispersed, adapted population across the continent, informing them that the time for transition had arrived. The facility had not contained them, it had summoned them. He caught sight of his reflection in the driver's side mirror, a haggard man, unshaven, eyes red-rimmed and panicked. But in the deep shadows of the rear window, reflected slightly, he saw another taller shape. It stood behind his own reflection, its head tilted, watching him. It was lean and indistinct, but the profile was definitely non-human, the ears high and pointed, the massive skull lowered in contemplation. He slammed his hand against the door, jolting himself. The reflection disappeared instantly. There was nothing in the back seat but old maps and technical manuals. He restarted the engine, driving hard toward the dawn. The light was still hours away, but he was driven by the single desperate hope that the sun might burn away the shadows that were rapidly closing in. Shadows that were no longer just the absence of light, but active, malevolent observers. He was the last technician of a collapsing civilization, driving through the silent, occupied country, watched by forms that were now perfectly integrated into the night. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and sickly oranges, but the light did not bring solace. It merely illuminated the perfected horror of the substitution. He drove into a small town 50 miles outside the main highway grid, seeking a place of public anonymity, a cup of coffee, and a brief return to human structure. The streets were too neat, the lawns too uniformly green. The people moved with a disturbing synchronicity. He understood now the chilling implication of why he was allowed to leave the facility. He was no threat. His knowledge, however extensive, was too specialized, too locked in the language of electricity and concrete, to stop a biological process that had been decades in the making. He was the useless informational carrier, the final, desperate witness to the silent, bloodless triumph of the dogmen. The townsfolk he saw walking the sidewalks or pulling up in their perfectly clean sport utility vehicles shared an uncanny physical regularity. Their faces were too healthy, their symmetry too pronounced. They moved in the same cadence, their expressions settling quickly into an identical low-level placidity. There were no individual quirks, no tired slouch of the shoulders, no unique scowl or nervous tic. Everywhere he looked, he saw the perfected copy, the template of human calm. The world had been replaced by an army of flawless, emotionless masks. He found a diner, its interior smelling faintly of bacon grease and industrial cleaner. He ordered a coffee, the porcelain cup heavy and warm in his hands. He took a sip. The coffee, usually a source of grounding comfort, tasted of absolutely nothing. It was hot, wet, and utterly without flavor. Sterile, bland, chemically correct, yet devoid of the comforting bitterness of the roasted bean. His senses, strained by terror, failed him. The world had lost its texture, its vibrancy, replaced by the phantasm of sensory input. He watched the waitress wipe down the counter. Her movements were smooth, efficient, perfect. Too perfect. He took his coffee and sat on a scarred wooden bench in a small municipal park a block from the diner. The trees were lush, the air smelled of cut grass. Everything was beautiful, pristine, and wrong. A man in a sharp, dark business suit approached the bench and sat down beside him. He was unremarkable, mid-40s, clean-shaven, hair neatly parted. He carried a leather briefcase, his posture relaxed and easy. He turned his head slowly toward the technician and offered a smile, a flawless, broad, human smile that reached his eyes. "Nice morning, isn't it?" the man asked, his voice low, resonant, and calm. The technician could not speak. He just stared at the man's face, searching for the fissure, the microscopic flaw. He found it. In the center of the man's otherwise normal brown iris, there was a minute, vertical slit, a sliver of polished obsidian reflecting the sun. It was the pupillary structure of a highly organized nocturnal hunter, contained behind a flawless human facade. "How do you think?" the man continued, his eyes locked on the horizon. "Things are going to change around here, now that the summer's really starting." The technician managed only a shallow inhale. The man chuckled softly, a warm, perfectly manufactured sound. He adjusted the briefcase on his lap. "You were down at level 51, weren't you? Maintenance. Essential personnel." The technician remained mute, a monument of frozen dread. "That facility," the man said, standing up and dusting off his immaculate trousers, "is no longer required." He did not wait for a response. He simply walked away, merging seamlessly into the flow of other placid, symmetrical individuals walking down the sunny park path. The technician remained on the bench, holding the cold, tasteless coffee. The end of the world had arrived, not with explosions or plagues, but with quiet, absolute biological consensus. He was the last breathing echo of human reality, stranded in a world now efficiently managed and perfectly maintained by those whom his species had long ago relegated to myth. He looked up at the sun and waited for the shadow of the dog man, stretching long and slow behind him, to finally catch up.